March 4th, 1973. The woods off Chapin in Saginaw County, Michigan, sat in an eerie, unnatural stillness that morning. Two brothers, Wayne and Bill Summers, were wandering an old logging path, the kind kids explore for adventure, when they stumbled onto something that would change their lives forever. There, among the fallen leaves and frozen brush, lay the partially clothed body of a young woman. Her cranberry red coat, once bright and cheerful, was stained, her stillness a heartbreaking contrast with the peaceful woods around her. In that moment, the quiet innocence of rural Michigan was lost forever. The scene was grim beyond words when the deputies arrived. Whatever faint hope remained that Dawn had simply run away or was being held somewhere, vanished instantly. The young woman had been shot 3 times with a .22 caliber weapon. 2 bullets to the head, 1 to the back. Scrapes on her arms, torn fabric on her clothes. These told a story of struggle, of courage, of a desperate fight for life. Only weeks beforehand, Dawn Lee Swan Magyar had been a happy young wife and mother. Now she was gone, her life violently cut short, her dreams silenced. And whoever did it had been careful. The crime scene was almost spotless, a brutal, calculated act that had left investigators with little to go on. Her murder haunted Michigan for nearly 30 years. Her family and her husband, her mother, her son, had waited for answers that never came. Until one day, they finally did. Before we continue this story, take a moment to subscribe and like this video. Your support keeps these long-forgotten cases alive. And hey, it also helps the mysterious YouTube algorithm show you more of these stories when they break. Now, Dawn's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was the first domino, the event that would finally expose decades of buried darkness. When the truth finally surfaced in 2001, it didn't point toward a stranger or some nameless drifter. The killer wasn't a shadow that had come and gone. He was someone known, a man with a violent past who had lived quietly among Michiganders for years, hiding monstrous secrets behind a friendly face. The story of how he was finally caught is one of persistence. Families who refused to stop fighting, detectives who wouldn't let her file collect dust, and modern DNA technology that gave a long-silenced victim her voice back. The small town of Chesaning would never be the same. For years after Dawn's murder, fear drifted through the community like a cold wind off Lake Huron. Neighbors looked at each other with quiet suspicion. People began to realize that even in the most peaceful of places, evil can sometimes wear a familiar face. When it finally came out, almost 30 years later, it hit like an earthquake. This man had been living an ordinary life, raising a family, working an everyday job, and laughing with friends, while he was carrying a secret darker than anyone could fathom. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel and how they connect people across miles and generations. Now, let's rewind. Let's go back to where it all began. January 1973. The village of Chesaning, Michigan, was pure Midwestern charm. Snow-dusted streets, friendly neighbors, and a quiet rhythm built on hard work and faith. Sundays meant church bells, warm coffee, and unlocked doors. People knew each other by name. It was a place where trust was as natural as breathing. In a cozy 2-story home on Elm Street filled with the laughter of a young family, lived 20-year-old Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. Her husband Donald, everyone called him Don, and her 1-year-old son Peter also shared that home. Dawn was full of energy and light. Friends said she had an unforgettable laugh, the kind that could lift your mood in an instant. She loved finding little treasures in shops, something special for her mother or a new decoration for their home. Her life was simple, but it was beautiful, full of promise. On the morning of January 27th, 1973, the air was crisp, but Dawn's mood was bright. It was an ordinary day, or at least it should have been. She kissed baby Peter goodbye, left him in Dawn's care, and borrowed her neighbor Mildred Albright's shiny silver 1970 Ford Pinto. That car felt almost fancy, a little luxury for a young mom. She planned to drive to Owosso, about 20 minutes away, to shop at the Owosso Plaza, a modern mall with bright windows and busy aisles. Dawn had a list, a few things for her new home, maybe a birthday gift for her mother, Eleanor Swan. It was the kind of errand any young mom would run on a chilly Saturday morning. As she pulled out of the driveway, the sky was a muted winter gray, quiet, peaceful, ordinary. Nobody knew it was going to be the last time anyone saw her alive. In 1973, shopping centers weren't exactly high-security affairs. No cameras, no guards patrolling the parking lots, just open doors and trusting faces. The Owosso Plaza was alive that day with the weekend buzz of families and shoppers, and among them was 20-year-old Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. She moved down the aisles with her usual exuberant energy, picking up a few household items, pausing to admire displays, enjoying a quiet afternoon to herself. Around 2:30 p.m., near the entrance of J.C. Penney, she ran into a familiar face, Janice Simpson, a close friend from high school. They chatted briefly the way old friends do, catching up about their families and plans for the evening. Dawn mentioned wanting to get home soon. Dawn would be expecting her, and little Peter would need his dinner. It was a casual, everyday exchange, and tragically, it would be the last confirmed time anyone saw Dawn alive. As the winter sun began to dip low over Chesaning's snow-dusted fields, Dawn started to get worried. Dawn should have been home hours ago. Baby Peter, a normally happy and easygoing little boy, had become fussy and restless, his cries echoing through the house. Dawn paced from window to window, stepping out onto the porch every few minutes, peering down the road in the hope he would see that silver Ford Pinto turn the corner. But the driveway remained empty. Dinner, which was to be prepared by Dawn, remained untouched in the kitchen. When he phoned their neighbor Mildred to ask if Dawn had returned the car, she said no. She hadn't seen her since that morning. That's when the dread started to creep in, slow but heavy. By nightfall, the house felt cold and hollow. The cheerful rhythm of their small family was gone, replaced by the anxious tick of the clock and Peter's muffled sobs. If you're just joining us, be sure to subscribe and hit that like button. It helps keep these powerful stories from fading into history and ensures you'll see more like this when new cases are solved by 9 p.m. Don couldn't take it anymore. His heart pounding, he grabbed the landline, those big clunky phones with the spiraled cord, and dialed the Chesaning Police Department. His voice shook, but his words were steady. "My wife is missing." 20 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars lit up their quiet street. Officers from both the Chesaning Police and the Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department stepped inside, their notebooks ready. Patrolman Jedediah Clark and Deputy Roscoe Hammond began with the usual detached questions, the kind that can feel heartless when you're desperate for help. What time did she leave? Where was she headed? Did she seem upset? Don answered every question to the best of his ability, his voice hoarse but controlled. Beside him, Dawn's mother, Eleanor Swan, pale and terror-stricken, clutched a tissue in her shaking hand. She nodded at times, confirming details, her eyes darting toward the hallway where Peter finally slept. Then came the question that always makes husbands freeze. What was she wearing? Don closed his eyes, seeing her distinctly in his mind. A red wool coat, cranberry red, dark jeans, her old leather boots. His voice softened. She always looked so put together, even when she said she didn't try. The officers jotted notes, then asked if Dawn had been depressed, if there had been any arguments or money problems. That's when Don snapped. "No," he said firmly. "She had no reason to leave, none." The room was silent for a moment. He could feel their eyes on him, not in sympathy, but in suspicion. That quiet doubt cut deep. Outside, neighbors were gathering. A casserole was brought over by Marjorie Peterson from next door, her hands trembling as she set it down. Harold Jenkins. The mailman arrived with a flashlight and offered to search the nearby streets. Whispers were passed from porch to porch, with some people praying and others murmuring about dark possibilities. The once cozy Magyar home had turned into a command post. Phones ringing nonstop, friends calling in panic. Dawn's brothers, Max and Larry, asked the same desperate question over and over. "Have you heard anything?" And every time, Dawn had the same tired response. "No, nothing." Eleanor sat quiet and still in the corner, clutching a framed photo of Dawn, smiling, young, full of life, her fingers clenching the edges so tightly that her knuckles whitened. Somewhere down the hall, Peter slept peacefully, ignorant that his mother was gone, that the world around him had shifted into something dark and unfamiliar. With the sunrise of January 28th, 1973, the whole town was talking. News of the young mother who had vanished had traveled fast. People at diners and gas stations whispered over their coffee cups. Neighbors made uneasy eye contact on the way to church. Everyone knew Dawn. Everybody hoped she'd just show up, maybe stranded or delayed. But deep inside, they feared the worst. For Dawn and Eleanor, that Sunday morning was too much to bear. It was their first without her. The air hung heavy inside the house. The only sound was Peter's confused cry, the heartbreaking sound of a child calling for a mother who would never come home. The next morning, police were back on Elm Street early, bearing large maps and clipboards. They laid them all out across the kitchen table, delineating possible routes and areas to be searched. Dawn, who hadn't slept all night, shakily pointed to places Dawn went to regularly in Owosso. The plaza, the side streets, a few shortcuts she sometimes took on her way home. Eleanor, having soothed baby Peter, tried to remember every detail of her daughter's routines, where she liked to park, which stores she usually browsed first. Her voice shook as she spoke. Her mind was replaying every habit Dawn had in painful detail. By 8 a.m., an emergency meeting was held at the Owosso Police Department. For the rest of the day and through the night, city police and the Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department combed the area with dozens of volunteers, neighbors, friends, even complete strangers, all determined to help bring Dawn home. Flyers were printed bearing her photo with the bold headline, "Missing. Have you seen Dawn Lee Swan Magyar?" They were taped to storefronts, gas stations, churches, even the entrance of the Owosso Plaza where she was last seen. The bright smile of Dawn looked out from every post, a painful reminder of the young life that was suddenly missing. Search teams spread out across Owosso and the surrounding countryside, fanning through alleys and parking lots and frozen back roads. They called her name into the cold Michigan wind, that faint, fragile hope still alive in their heads that maybe she was lost, maybe injured, maybe she'd appear shivering but alive. K-9 units followed her scent from the plaza's parking lot onto the main road. And then, nothing. The trail simply vanished, as if the town itself had swallowed her whole. By midday, the tension was thick. Don, having left Peter in Eleanor's care, joined the search. He stood quietly at the edge of the police perimeter, eyes scanning every face, every field, searching for a sign. Each time an officer shook his head, Don's hope dimmed a little. More reporters from the Owosso Argus Press arrived, their cameras flashing. The headline would hit the next morning: Young Chesaning Mother Vanishes. Police expand search. In the afternoon, Officer Charles Finch led a group of volunteers toward a quiet, lesser-used parking area behind the old Montgomery ward. It was secluded, half hidden by a row of tall pine trees. That's when someone noticed it, a silver 1970 Ford Pinto, its windows dusted lightly with snow. They approached it cautiously, hearts pounding. And then the truth sank in. It was Dawn's car. The police quickly roped off the area, ordering everyone back. Don and Eleanor were called to the scene. When Don saw the car, his knees nearly buckled. Eleanor broke down, sobbing into the arms of a family friend. Her thoughts, even through the grief, went straight to Peter. At home, waiting for a mother who would never return. Inside, investigators noticed several shopping bags on the passenger seat. The items Dawn had purchased that afternoon. Her brown leather purse was on the dashboard, but something wasn't right. Her car keys weren't in the ignition. They were scattered across the floor near the driver's seat, as if dropped or grabbed in panic. The seats seemed untouched. The doors weren't forced open, but the scattered keys told a story. Something had happened, and it had happened fast. It was as if Dawn had stepped out of the car for a moment, and then simply vanished. The silver Pinto sat there, cold, quiet beneath the pines, the only witness to an unthinkable mystery. The sun had dipped below the gray horizon of Michigan, and officers surrounded the car in silence. Don stared blankly, one thought repeating endlessly in his mind. Something terrible has happened. That discovery shattered whatever fragile hope remained. To Dawn and Eleanor, it was the beginning of their worst nightmare. To Peter, then still too young to understand, it marked the night his life changed forever. And for the whole of Owosso, finding that abandoned car was the first deep crack in the illusion of safety that had so long defined small-town Michigan. That night, after the lot behind Montgomery Ward had been secured, the police had the car towed to the Shiawassee County Sheriff's Department for forensic processing. The tow truck rumbled through the dark January night, its lights flashing dimly across the quiet streets. Nearby, Dawn stood with red-rimmed eyes following every movement. The car was coming back, but Dawn was not. In the sheriff's department, investigators made room for what was now considered a crucial crime scene. It was 1973, long before modern forensics, but the officers were meticulous. They laid canvas tarps, adjusted lamps, and began their work. The investigation was headed by Detective Arthur Bennett, an experienced investigator. Technicians with tweezers, magnifying glasses, and flashlights documented every inch of the Pinto, the dust on the windows, the scuffs on the tires, even the way the door handles were angled. That's when Bennett noticed something, a faint dark stain on the passenger side floor mat, partially concealed by one of Dawn's shopping bags under ultraviolet light. It glowed faintly. A technician delicately swabbed it, sealing it into a small labeled vial. It might have been nothing, or it might have been blood. Then another officer found something else, a single coarse, dark strand of hair caught in the crevice of the driver's seat. It was short and thick. Unlike Dawn's fine, light-colored hair, it was tweezed out carefully, bagged, and labeled. Every detail was documented and photographed, then logged. Every smudge, every fiber mattered. But it was 1973. Forensics was still in its infancy. No DNA testing, no computer databases, no quick matches. The clues they gathered would have to sit in evidence lockers, waiting for a future that could finally make sense of them. In 1973, the science of investigation was painfully limited. DNA testing was decades away, and even a top-notch laboratory could narrow potential suspects only through basic blood typing. Hair analysis? Mostly guesswork. It could hint at similarities but never prove anything. So those two pieces of evidence, the faint stain on the car mat and that single coarse dark hair, were carefully collected and sealed. However, they didn't bring the case closer to answers. They were pieces in a puzzle and a picture that no one had the tools to see yet. While forensic officers were working in the lab, the station's hallways were abuzz with reporters. The story had exploded across the region. Newspapers updated hourly. Radio stations repeated every new detail. And that evening's TV broadcast opened with a haunting image. Dawn's silver Pinto under a tarp, its headlights glowing in the background, and a chilling caption scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Missing woman's car found, but she remains missing. Back home, Dawn and Eleanor sat paralyzed in front of the TV. The car on the screen was unmistakable. Mildred's silver Pinto, now a national symbol of dread. Peter whimpered softly in Dawn's arms, sensing the tension. Beside them, Eleanor wept, repeating over and over, "If the car's there, where's my girl?" Mute, Dawn had no answers, only the holding of his family close, and knowing deep inside that this evidence was not a sign of hope. It was proof something terrible had happened. That night, police completed their preliminary report. It read simply, "Vehicle located in isolated parking lot, all personal effects present. Nothing shows theft or forceful entry. Suspicious stain collected, hair of unknown origin recovered." For investigators, it was just the beginning of a long process. But for the Magyar family, that report might as well have been a death sentence without a body. The reality was setting in. Dawn wasn't coming home. By the next morning, January 29th, the Owosso Argus-Press hit the newsstands with bold black headlines, "Missing woman's car found. Still no trace of Dawn Magyar." The community was restless, police were under pressure. And while search teams continued to comb the surrounding areas, detectives shifted their focus to witness interviews from the Owosso Plaza, the last place Dawn had been seen alive. Detectives John Barnes and Brenda Farrell spent their morning at their desks, working out timelines by hand. No computers, no databases, just yellow notepads and sharpened pencils. They corroborated through Dawn's friend, Janice Simpson, that she had spoken with Dawn at about 2:30 p.m. That agreed with another sighting by Silas Croft, a quiet clerk at Woolworths, who remembered a young woman in a cranberry red coat leaving the mall at about 2:40, carrying several shopping bags. But it was another witness, Phyllis Harding, who offered something different, a detail that made both detectives stop and look at each other. Phyllis was a clerk at the Plaza's record store. Just about the time Dawn would have been leaving, Phyllis had stepped out to load groceries into her trunk. A few rows away, she saw Dawn standing beside her silver car, talking to a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, with a receding hairline and a worn denim jacket. The conversation appeared cursory and unruffled. A couple of words were said, but what really caught the attention of Phyllis was a dark blue Ford pickup, an older model parked nearby. She noticed it idling for some time before it slowly pulled out of the lot, just as Dawn and the man walked out of view toward the back of the parking area. Her memory was sharp but incomplete. She couldn't see his face clearly, and she wasn't sure if the two knew each other. Then another lead came in. Ronald Davies, a janitor at the plaza, told police he'd noticed that same dark blue pickup parked far from the entrance, oddly distant from the busy area. For much of the afternoon, he hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now the details seemed significant. Yet no one remembered a license plate. As detectives placed the witness accounts alongside one another, a pattern slowly took form. Dawn left the plaza at around 2:40 p.m. She was seen talking to an unknown man near her car. A dark blue Ford pickup truck was nearby. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was something. In the briefing room that evening, Detective Barnes frowned as he studied the notes pinned to the wall. Every clue led to that moment in that parking lot, one that disappeared into thin air. When the detectives called in the Magyar family for an update, Don sat opposite them, stiff, his hands clasped tight as they detailed what the witnesses described. His face crumpled. He could picture it perfectly. Dawn's smile, her polite gestures, the shifting of shopping bags in her arms. She wasn't scared, he said softly. She wasn't worried. So, someone did something to her right after she left that store, didn't they? Eleanor reached for his hand, her own trembling. At home, little Peter had clung to her all morning, sensing the sorrow that filled the house. Back in town, the rumors spread faster than the police could contain them. People whispered about the man in the denim jacket, about the dark blue pickup truck. Some swore they'd seen it before. Others claimed to recognize the description of the stranger. But when police chased each tip, matching names, checking vehicles, questioning owners, the results were the same. Dead ends. No corroboration, no solid leads. By that evening, local radio stations carried the latest witness descriptions, their voices grave. Police want to know about an unidentified man seen talking with missing mother Dawn Magyar near her silver Ford Pinto, and an older dark blue Ford pickup truck seen leaving the area. The local news was grim and unrelenting. "Unknown man," the announcer intoned on the evening broadcast. Witnesses recount Dawn Magyar's final moments. As families around Owosso shook their heads in disbelief, a chill crept through living rooms at the very idea that an ordinary young mother, out shopping on a quiet Sunday, had disappeared under such mysterious circumstances. Overnight, Dawn had become the center of a puzzle no one yet could solve, and despite a few scattered clues, the Owosso police still couldn't piece together the full picture. The investigation report closed that day with the sobering summary that Dawn Magyar was last seen leaving the Owosso Plaza at 2:40 p.m. Multiple witnesses report a dark blue pickup in the parking lot, and one saw her speaking briefly with an unidentified man. But there simply wasn't enough information to identify a suspect. The next morning, the newspaper headlined the story under a headline that signaled much frustration and uncertainty. Witness accounts provide clues, but Magyar disappearance remains elusive. The two sat quietly at the Magyar home, staring at the paper as if answers were to be found among the print. Their son Peter, a happy baby who usually babbled incessantly, was quieter now, almost responding to the heavy atmosphere surrounding him. Every lead seemed to go nowhere. Every hint offered tiny, short-lived hope that dissolved almost immediately. Weeks stretched into a grim eternity. February gave way to March, and Dawn remained missing. Dawn and Eleanor clung to each other, their panic slowly solidifying into a dull ache that endured Peter. 14 months old now, often looked toward the front door, his babbling tinged with questioning tones, as if expecting his mother to materialize. Eleanor tried to placate him, repeating the mantra she had repeated 1,000 times. "Mama's coming home, sweetheart." But to her own ears, the words sounded empty. The massive searches dominating the community in January faded away. Flyers hung on boards were now weathered and torn. Smaller, somber updates replaced the daily headlines in the Owosso Argus Press. That bright-burning hope in January was now a fragile ember, flickering against the chill of uncertainty. Then, on the Sunday afternoon of March 4th, 1973, another horror had its turn. 10-year-old Wayne Summers and his 12-year-old brother Bill spent a lot of time in a dense stand of woods near Chapin, a tiny, unincorporated community in Saginaw County not too far from Chesaning. Local kids often roamed the area, building forts, chasing squirrels, following winding deer trails through thick undergrowth. As they pressed deeper, near an abandoned logging path, a foul smell hit them. Following it, they came upon a scene that would haunt their memories for the rest of their lives. A partially concealed body, frozen beneath thorny bushes and a thin layer of winter debris. Terrified, the boys ran home, bursting into the living room where their parents, Quentin and Helen Summers, were reading the Sunday paper. "We found something. A person in the woods," Wayne stammered, his face pale. Within the hour, deputies from the Saginaw County Sheriff's Department were on the scene, led by Sheriff Vernon Hayes and lead investigator, Detective Alvin Greer. The area was cordoned off immediately as forensic technicians worked quickly in the fading daylight. The confirmation was devastating. The partially clothed body belonged to a young woman. Her cranberry red wool coat, dark jeans, and worn leather boots were still identifiable. But it was the wedding ring on her finger that sealed her identity: Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. Detective Greer carried the news back to the Magyar home. Dawn and Eleanor were left numb. Eleanor collapsed, the unspoken fear of weeks now made horrifyingly real. Dawn wasn't just missing, she was dead. The coroner's initial examination, followed by a full autopsy, revealed the brutal fact that Dawn had been raped and then shot 3 times. Once in the back, twice in the head, all from a .22 caliber firearm. The shots that killed her had been fired with chilling precision, unmistakably deliberate. There were signs of a struggle everywhere. Scrapes on her arms, torn clothes, evidence that she had fought desperately in her final moments. The site itself provided few clues immediately. The frozen, hard ground preserved some traces, but it was tough to discover footprints or any other forensic evidence. The investigation immediately turned into a full murder inquiry, led by the Michigan State Police, with Detective Barnes and newly assigned Detective Sergeant Steve Harshberger leading. The .22 caliber firearm became a critical focus. Police canvassed gun owners in the Chesaning and Owosso areas. One man, Robert Shaw, a resident of Chesaning who knew Dawn casually, voluntarily offered his .22 for testing. But forensic analysis, careful by 1973 standards, quickly ruled it out. The rifling marks on the bullets did not match his weapon. Another promising lead dissolved. News of Dawn's death spread like wildfire. The Owosso Argus Press ran a stark, black-bordered headline that would forever mark the date in the community's memory. Dawn Lee Swan Magyar found dead. Murder shocks local families. A disappearance that started off as a nightmare was now confirmed. Yet despite the horror, the case was far from solved. The investigation kicked into high gear, but the initial shock was gradually worn away by a deep, lingering grief and a chilling sense of fear that settled over the once peaceful communities of Chesaning and Owosso. Who could do such a heinous thing to a young mother? Public pressure for law enforcement to capture Dawn's killer intensified. Sorrow was palpable at the Magyar home. Dawn moved through the days in a haze, while Eleanor struggled with bouts of uncontrollable sobbing, holding little Peter close as if to shield him from the incomprehensible evil that had touched their lives, Dawn's brothers, Max and Larry Swan, arrived, their faces grim, offering what support they could. Hundreds attended the funeral at St. Christopher Parish in Chesaning, where Father Michael O'Connell spoke of Dawn's lively spirit and the tremendous loss everyone had suffered. Her tiny son, Peter, was taken into her arms as she was lowered into the earth. Friends, neighbors, and relatives exchanged words of condolence and whispered prayers as one after another came forward to pay their respects. But even in the outpouring from the community, one thing would not go away: the dark, unresolved mystery of her murder. As the brutal Michigan winter gave way to spring, leads began to run cold. Detectives Barnes and Harshberger followed every tip, interviewed hundreds of people, and meticulously cataloged each piece of evidence: the coarse dark hair, the blood stain, the recovered bullets. They chased reports of dark blue pickup trucks and revisited witness statements again and again. Yet the puzzle pieces refused to form a clear picture. Whoever had taken Dawn seemed to have vanished completely, leaving behind nothing but grief and unanswered questions. As the days turned into more than a week, Detective Sergeant Harshberger, along with Detective Sergeant Mark Pendergrast, who had joined the case to help organize the growing mountain of paperwork, found themselves increasingly frustrated. Without new evidence or a concrete suspect, the investigation slowed to a painful, grinding halt. By the end of 1973, the original fervor of the case had dissipated. The large evidence box labeled Magyar, Dawn Lee Swan murder, January 1973, was relegated to a high shelf in the Sheriff's Department evidence room. In that box were hundreds of pages of reports, search maps, crime scene photographs, and carefully sealed samples: the blood stain, the unidentified hair, and the preserved bullets, all waiting patiently for new technology or some unexpected lead to revive the case. To the Magyar family, the silence was not an end, but the beginning of an agonizing, decades-long wait for justice. Dawn, Eleanor, and little Peter carried the unbearable weight of her memory, a wound time could never fully heal. On a quiet evening, as twilight fell over the little town of Chesaning, Eleanor sat rocking Peter, softly humming a lullaby. The boy squirmed and pointed a chubby finger at her face. "Mama!" he babbled, a clear, sweet sound that came with a pang into Eleanor's heart. She froze, her eyes welling, overcome with the ache of loss. In that innocent moment, Peter had voiced the devastating truth of their lives. The mother he called for would never truly return. By now, the case of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar had officially become what investigators called a cold case. Chesaning, once a peaceful village, now bore the indelible scar of a brutal, unsolved murder. By 1978, 5 years after the disappearance of Dawn, everything was completely different in her home. Dawn Magyar was no more the bright young husband. He lived his life with quiet grief etched into his face as he diligently went to work, back home to look after Peter and Eleanor, and prepared dinner. But there was some permanent sadness in his eyes. Eleanor Swan, the strong one, had aged under the strain of her daughter's unsolved murder. She became the primary caretaker of Peter, showering him with love with every passing day, which basically carried a little sting of absence. The Magyar family continued their prayer vigils, as they had since the day Dawn disappeared. Every year on January 27th and March 4th, they would hold a gathering at St. Christopher Parish, or outside their house with a few dedicated neighbors like Mildred Albright, Marjorie Peterson, and others. Choked voices could be heard singing hymns into the cold Michigan night, and the prayers floated with the wind, hoping that someday the truth would be brought out. It was one way for them to make sure Dawn's memory lived on, along with her presence and love in their hearts. Beside her stood Peter, tall for his years, holding a small white candle. His face was solemn, a silent participant in a grief he was too young to understand, yet instinctively felt years later the press would revisit the story from time to time. The tone, however, changed. The case generated less and less empathy and more pessimism. To the world, Dawn Magyar would become another entry on Michigan's long list of unsolved murders. For the Magyars, though, the absence still cuts. Every day, every meal, every prayer, a reminder that Dawn's gone, and the world has yet to deliver justice. Over the years, the case of Dawn cast a long shadow on the community. Firstly, people clung to hope, some openly admitting it. If the killer were out there, surely he'd have been caught by now. Others whispered about drifters or strangers, outsiders who may have wandered through town. As time went on, that early division only widened, leaving in its wake a prevailing unease in a place once defined by trust and close-knit connections. Peter grew up under that shadow, carrying memories of a mother whom he only knew through stories and fading photographs. He was a quiet, contemplative child, often sketching alone, using his imagination as a refuge from the heavy silence that filled the Magyar home. At school, he sometimes faced cruel whispers. "Your mom was murdered, wasn't she?" Those careless words would leave him crying at his desk, feeling the weight of a world which had been cruel and unfair from the very start. His father, Don, was an immovable rock, but the profound loss subtly created distance at times. Even at home, Peter often felt he faced the world alone. He traced the outline of Dawn's face in old photographs, his mind conjuring up the woman whose life was brutally cut short. For almost 20 years, Dawn Magyar's case sat in the cold case unit, collecting dust. The small blood stain, the unidentified hair, the preserved bullets, all carefully stored, couldn't be analyzed with the technology of the time. The Michigan State Police juggled dozens of new cases, diverting resources and attention. To the outside world, Dawn became just another name on a growing list of unsolved Michigan disappearances. Yet to the Magyar family, and in particular for Peter, the silence was never really an end. Every vigil, every small article, every report of new scientific advancements touched a fragile flame of hope, which kept Peter going, hanging on to the one day when the silence would break and the truth about his mother's disappearance would finally emerge. By the mid-1990s, a quiet revolution began to take hold and slowly started transforming the world of forensic science. Advanced DNA technology, once the stuff of science fiction, would now permit investigators to identify individuals from minuscule biological samples. In East Lansing, at the Michigan State Police DNA Laboratory, a dedicated team scientists like forensic expert Randy O'Colbrey started re-examining old, seemingly unsolvable cases, their work at first driven by the promise of this new science. One name among the dusty files leapt out at veteran investigators: Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. Detective Sergeant Steve Harshberger, who remembered the bitter cold of January 1973 and the young mother who disappeared then, saw a chance. Detective Lieutenant Gail V. Tobin approved reopening the case, certain that preserved biological evidence. The small blood stain, the unidentified hair, and most importantly, seminal fluid found on Dawn's clothing could finally be tested with revolutionary methods. Harshberger personally retrieved the evidence box, carefully labeled, from the storage in the department. Opening it, he found yellowed pages and decades-old sealed samples. This was the key, a light piercing through decades of darkness. The Michigan State Police DNA Laboratory worked on the samples between 1995 and 1998, minuscule traces of seminal fluid, fibers from Dawn's clothing, and the mysterious hair were subjected to the exigent new DNA amplification and profiling techniques. The results were slow, but definitive. A number of potential suspects, including Robert Shaw, whose .22 caliber gun had been ruled out decades earlier, were excluded with absolute certainty. At last, the field had been narrowed. They now had a DNA profile of the perpetrator, distinct and unknown, but it yielded no match in any existing database. By the late 1990s, Steve Harshberger, who had spent decades occasionally pulling Dawn's file and never letting it rest, felt the pressing weight of time. He and Detective Mark Pendergrast began a scrupulous review of every old lead, every person of interest, and every individual with a history of violent crime connected to the Owosso or Chesaning areas in 1973. The work was painstaking, manual, and long before the days of modern genealogical databases. They were trying to match an unknown DNA profile against known suspects from many decades earlier. During this exhaustive search, one name kept cropping up: Gerald Leroy Wingard. His file was chilling. Convicted in 1961 of armed robbery and rape while attending the University of Michigan, he had served 6 years before being paroled in the late 1960s. Old reports placed him in the Owosso Chesaning area in January 1973, purportedly visiting a friend. More troublingly, in 1981 he had been arrested in connection with the Laura Mae McVeigh murder case in Eaton Rapids. A charge later dismissed on a technicality. The pattern was unmistakable. A violent history, confirmed presence near the original crime scene, and suspicion in similar brutal crimes. He fit the profile. The dates, the locations, the past, everything lined up. Detective Harshberger leaned toward Detective Gail V. Tobin voiced grim and murmured, "He's our primary person of interest for direct DNA testing." By early 2001, investigators were ready to make their move. Gerald Leroy Wingard, then 60 years old, lived a seemingly unremarkable life in Centerline, a quiet suburb of Detroit. He shared his home with his fourth wife, Teresa, worked in the accounting department at Chrysler's Sterling Heights stamping plant, and was, to all accounts, a polite, respectable neighbor. His grown daughter from another marriage also lived nearby, and to neighbors Richard and Sandra Ellis, he was just the quiet man next door, the type who nodded politely or waved when passing by. That ordinary facade made the task ahead all the more unsettling. A covert surveillance operation was set in motion. Plainclothes officers with the Michigan State Police tracked Wingard's daily routines of leaving for work, running errands for groceries, and going on an intermittent basis to a local park. Their goal was clear: get a DNA sample for direct comparison with the profile from the 1973 crime scene. On the morning of March 5, 2001, their patience was rewarded. Wingard came out of his house to check his mailbox, smoked a cigarette for several minutes, then flicked the butt into the bushes before going back inside. Detective Clara Monroe, part of the surveillance team, moved in quickly, picking up the cigarette with sterile tweezers. It was carefully sealed and rushed to the Michigan State Police DNA laboratory. The wait was agonizing. Meanwhile, Don McGuire, now a grandfather, continued to live a quiet life in Chesaning, still attending the annual vigils with Eleanor. Peter turned 29 and continued to carry the long shadow of his mother's unsolved murder. Eleanor, now totally white-haired, continued to pray daily for justice. Then on March the 7th, 2001, just 2 days later, the call came. Randy O'Colbry's voice was calm, yet firm. "We have a 100% definitive match. The DNA from the cigarette belongs to the perpetrator of the Dawn Magyar murder." The news sent shockwaves through the Michigan State Police. Detective Harshberger felt a rush of adrenaline mixed with a chilling sense of vindication. A cold case, lying dormant for nearly 3 decades, was finally alive. An arrest warrant was quickly issued for Gerald Leroy Wingard. Prosecutor Dwayne Dennis and his team knew what the legal parameters were. Statute of limitations in 1973 prevented them from charging rape and kidnapping, but there was no time limit on first-degree murder. They had their charge. At dawn on March the 7th, 2001, Wingard's suburban street was shrouded with a pre-spring mist. Unmarked police vehicles blocked both ends. Officers from the Michigan State Police and Centerline PD moved into position. Shortly past 6 a.m., Detective Gail V. Tobin gave the command the battering ram hit. The door shook, then burst open. Officers led by Sergeant Paul Griffin surged inside. In the cluttered living room, Wingard stumbled, eyes wide, saying, What's going on?" In an instant, he was pinned to the floor, hands cuffed behind his back. The cold clink of metal ended nearly 3 decades of evasion. The neighbors watched in a stunned amazement. Richard Ellis, who lived next door, clutched his chest. "My God, he seemed so quiet, always kept his lawn neat." Doris May Bell shook her head, her voice trembling. "I waved to him just yesterday. You never know who's living next door." Wingard, in a rumpled gray t-shirt, disheveled, wrists gleaming in cuffs, was escorted out. "I didn't do anything. You've got the wrong guy," he protested, but his cries were drowned out by camera shutters and the buzz of reporters. Images of Wingard's arrest hit Michigan news channels within minutes. The ticker blared, "Arrest in 1973, Dawn Magyar cold case." In the brief news conference, Prosecutor Dwayne Dennis and Detective Gail V. Tobin addressed the media. "Nearly 3 decades after the event," Dennis began, "we have arrested Gerald Leroy Wingard, 60, a Centerline resident, charged with the first-degree murder of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. DNA evidence, which was painstakingly preserved and retested, confirms his involvement." When asked about motive, Detective Tobin replied, It's too early to conclude. What we do know is that this was a brutal, deliberate act of violence. Back in Chesaning, Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter watched the coverage on TV. Peter stood stiffly behind his father, hand on Dawn's shoulder. Emotions welled up: anger, relief, and a deep sense of vindication. At last, justice had knocked. Dawn exhaled, his voice thick with emotion. Finally, justice has come. Eleanor, tears streaming down her face, whispered, "Dawn, they found him." Peter squeezed his father's shoulder, eyes brimming. "Mom, she's not forgotten anymore." Headlines exploded across Michigan. Arrest made in 1973. Dawn Magyar cold case. Gerald Wingard, quiet neighbor or killer. And 3 decades of silence. Justice finally speaks. Experts discussed how DNA technology, specifically direct comparison, had cracked a nearly 30-year-old case, a landmark triumph in cold case investigation. The news sent shock, relief, and disbelief buzzing through Michigan's communities of Chesaning and Owosso. Flowers were left on the porch, candles were lit, and Dawn's photo was placed prominently in the window outside the Magyar home. One name was on the lips of everyone in the coffee shops, churches, and schools: Gerald Wingard. Some people were outraged that a man capable of such a crime had lived among them for decades while the Magyar family had suffered. Some were baffled. "I worked with him at Chrysler. Never thought he was capable of something like this." For the investigators, Wingard's arrest was far from the end. It marked the beginning of a long and thorny road. Prosecution, trial, revelation of all the facts. After decades of darkness, for the first time, justice had a face. It was one day that allowed Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter to hold on to hope, solace in the finally revealed truth. On March 8, 2001, Gerald Leroy Wingard sat slumped in a metal chair in the interrogation room of the Michigan State Police, hands cuffed before him. His gray hair was tangled, his eyes bloodshot from a night in custody, and his haggard face betrayed fatigue. Across from him, Detective Steve Harshberger watched coldly. The room was tight, with a 3-decade-old confrontation finally unfolding. At the first question, Wingard snapped, "I don't know her. Never heard of Dawn Magyar in my life." His voice was defiant. Harshberger didn't respond. Instead, he slid a thick file across the table. Photos of Dawn's car, the Owosso Plaza parking lot, and the detailed DNA report. "You say you don't know her," Harshberger said slowly. "So why was your DNA found at the scene where she was abducted, Mr. Wingard? The DNA on her clothing?" "You're making this up. DNA can be wrong," Wingard said with a hollow laugh. Harshberger calmly laid out the evidence. Seminal fluid and fibers, preserved immaculately since 1973, untouched until modern DNA testing. The 100% match with a cigarette butt collected in 2001. The exclusion of all other suspects. Wingard's smirk was gone. There was silence across the table as he stared at the evidence. Harshberger noted every twitch, every pulse of stress in Wingard's hands and neck. But Wingard still refused to break, spinning tales of hardship and claims of being unfairly targeted, despite his extensive criminal history. The DNA, however, did not lie an unshakable weapon in the hands of investigators. For prosecutor Dwayne Dennis, that was all the evidence he needed to pursue a strong indictment. That evening at the Magyar home, Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter heard of Wingard's denials. Pain and fury surged anew. "He's lying," Eleanor whispered, voice trembling. Peter, now as tall as his father, gripped Dawn's arm. "He won't get away with it, not this time." The headline screamed, "Suspect in Dawn. Magyar case denies all charges." But to the family and the growing, outraged community, the DNA spoke louder than any denial. The formal indictment against Gerald Leroy Wingard was announced in the Montgomery County Court on April 20th, 2001. After weeks of painstaking forensic analysis, prosecutor Dwayne Dennis declared charges of first-degree murder. The indictment detailed each piece of evidence: a DNA profile from the perpetrator at the crime scene, a 100% DNA match with Wingard, a forensic report confirming that Dawn had been raped and shot 3 times with a .22 caliber firearm, and historical records placing Wingard near the original crime scene with a violent criminal history. In the press room afterward, reporters crowded in as Dennis, Detective Lieutenant Gail V. Tobin, and Randy O'Colbray from the DNA lab held the indictment aloft for cameras. Dennis's voice rang clear. Justice may be delayed, but it is never gone. Today we charge Gerald Leroy Wingard for the brutal acts that took Dawn Lee Swan Magyar's life. After nearly 3 decades, the truth is finally exposed. Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter sat in the front row. As the prosecutor read the charges, Eleanor grasped Dawn's hand, the tears streaming down her face. Dawn's eyes did not veer from the podium. Peter stood firm, his jaw tight, silently absorbing the moment. "They finally named what happened to you," Dawn whispered. To the Magyar family, the indictment was more than legal paperwork. It was validation. Proof that Dawn had been the victim of a monstrous crime, not a woman who had simply vanished, as cruel rumors had suggested for decades. Outside the courthouse, Michigan's community gathered. Many held white candles, holding Dawn's photo high for the cameras. Clara Jennings, an old Chesaning neighbor, choked up during an interview. "Decades we lived in doubt and division. Today, justice gives us an answer." The headlines across Michigan heralded a new day. Gerald Wingard, formally charged in 1973, Dawn Magyar murder, and direct DNA comparison unlocks cold case. TV analysts characterized it as one of the biggest forensic investigation breaks ever in the state, a triumph of persistence, science, and refusal to let a crime fade into oblivion. The day of the indictment had already been a milestone for the investigative team led by Harshberger and Tobin, but now the trial loomed. Editorials across Michigan emphasized one powerful message: society mustn't ever forget missing victims, since even cold cases can be revived with determination, science, and persistence. For the detectives, the indictment was proof that their painstaking work, opening a dusty file with nothing but faint hope, had finally evolved into a full criminal case. "We brought Dawn home," Harshberger thought. "Now we must bring Wingard to justice." The trial was scheduled for November 2001, and as that date drew near, tensions rose. Reporters called it Michigan's largest cold case trial in decades. The community was divided. Most believed Wingard guilty, deserving the harshest punishment, while some whispered evidence, decades old, might not hold in court. It was a question broached endlessly in coffee shops, markets, and churches. Finally, would justice prevail? The Magyars lit candles in their house the night before the trial. Dawn gazed at the flickering light on Dawn's photo, whispering, "Tomorrow, justice begins to speak." Eleanor held Peter's hand, the resolve welling up within his eyes. Dawn fought. Now we fight for her, they thought together. Outside, it felt as if all of Michigan held its breath, in wait for that moment when truth would finally face justice's light. On November 5, 2001, the Owosso County Circuit Court was packed. Michigan's attention was fixed on the trial, decades in the making. Reporters crowded the halls, TV cameras aimed at the entrance as Dawn, Eleanor, and Peter Magyar entered the courtroom, resolute. Inside, the 12 jurors sat attentively, and across from them, Gerald Wingard appeared in a drab prison jumpsuit. His gray hair was thinner, his eyes averted, and his face ashen. Prosecutor Dwayne Dennis started with a strong statement. He took the jury through the events of January 27, 1973. Dawn leaving Owosso Plaza, the blue pickup truck seen by eyewitnesses, the frantic search, and finally the body being found, which was raped and shot. He went over the scientific evidence, preserved crime scene samples, the DNA profile, and the 100% match to Wingard's discarded cigarette butt. Dennis reminded the court of Wingard's violent criminal history and that it was known he was in the area. It was a fight, he said, for Dawn, and through modern science and relentless investigation, her perpetrator would finally face justice. The defense countered, emphasizing that no direct eyewitness saw Wingard commit the crime. They questioned the chain of custody for evidence preserved since 1973 and the reliability of decades-old witness accounts. But the prosecution thoroughly rebuffed each point. Randy O'Colbray testified to the strict preservation and analysis procedures, and Detective Harshberger presented a detailed timeline linking Wingard's known movements to the crime. DNA doesn't lie, Dennis concluded, his eyes fixed on the jury. During the victim impact statement, Peter Magyar, 29, stood with a framed photo of his young mother. His hands shook, voice cracking but firm. For 28 years, I lived without my mom and never knew why, never knew who took her. Today, the truth is proven that my mother was a victim of a ruthless man and that her memory deserves justice. My father, my grandmother, and I implore you, bring her peace. Eleanor sat beside Dawn, both wiping away tears. The courtroom fell silent. Even some jurors quietly dabbed their eyes. The judge banged the gavel, but Peter's words had sunk deep. The jury retired to deliberate after 5 days of evidence, testimony, and arguments. Outside, the Maguires held hands, their faces tense, and waited. Hours crawled by. Finally, after 8 hours, the jury returned. The clerk read the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, the defendant, Gerald Leroy Wingard, is guilty. The courtroom erupted. Eleanor burst into tears, embracing Peter. He bowed his head, tearing up, whispering, "Mom, it's finally done." The judge's voice rang clear. This court hereby sentences Gerald Leroy Wingard to life in prison without parole. The rest of his days will be confined behind bars, responsible for the wrongdoing he committed. Headlines screamed, "Justice delivered, Gerald Wingard sentenced to life without parole." Across Michigan, citizens lit candles outside the Magyar home. TV images of Dawn's family, tearful yet resolute, aired across the state. Detective Harshberger remained in the courtroom as it emptied, his eyes fixed upon the evidence board which had convicted Wingard. The thought swirling in his mind was that justice might be late, but it had arrived at that moment. Now, though, the case of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar was anything but cold and hopeless. It had transformed into a triumph of truth, persistence, and modern science. Although Wingard's life sentence closed the trial, the ripple effect, the sense of closure, vindication, and healing would echo way beyond the courtroom into Chesaning, Owosso, and into the hearts of those who had never forgotten Dawn. The community struggled to reconcile the man they knew, the quiet co-worker, the polite neighbor, with the cold-blooded killer who'd hidden his crime for nearly 3 decades. Neighbors turned up on television in shock. "We knew him from Chrysler. Never thought he could do this," one whispered. The shock rippled across Michigan, raising uncomfortable questions about how evil can hide in plain sight. National media quickly picked up the story. The New York Times ran the headline, "Michigan Man Convicted in 1973 Cold Case Murder." The Washington Post analyzed how DNA comparison had become a groundbreaking tool in solving decades-old crimes. Major networks including CNN, NBC, and ABC aired specials highlighting that Dawn Magyar's case proved cold cases never truly die. They can awaken with persistence, technology, and a single cigarette butt. Evening talk shows hosted forensic experts, investigative journalists, and family members of missing persons, emphasizing a chilling truth. Though justice may slumber for decades, it can come back. Meanwhile, the Magyar family was quietly preparing for a different kind of closure. On December 15, 2001, a memorial service for Dawn took place at St. Christopher Parish, followed by a gravesite service at the site where she had been laid to rest in 1973. Hundreds attended, not only relatives, but volunteers from the original 1973 search, loyal neighbors, and longtime friends. The simple headstone, placed decades earlier, now felt laden with meaning. Dawn stood at the grave, his voice choked. "For 28 years we visited this stone, wondering. Now I know peace." Eleanor held Peter's hand as she read a letter aloud. "My dearest Dawn, Peter grew up to be a wonderful man. He never forgot you. Now your killer is where he belongs." Tears streamed across the crowd. Flowers were laid, candles lit, and some strangers quietly whispered apologies for ever believing rumors about the case. The service became more than a farewell. It was a cleansing of the community's collective memory. Gerald Leroy Wingard died in prison on August 20th, 2022, after his last appeal was denied. His life behind bars confirmed that the arm of justice was long. The Magyar family's decades-long journey concluded in grief, yet in the knowledge that Dawn was not forgotten. They continued to carry her memory forward by advocating for cold cases. Peter emerged to be a strong voice for cold case resolution, speaking about his mother's story all over the nation. Chesaning remained a quiet Michigan village, but beneath its calm, Dawn's case left an indelible mark. It reminded residents that evil can lurk in plain sight, that the truth can lie buried for years, but that justice can return through technology, resolve, and people who refuse to give up. Dawn Lee Swan Magyar's story is not solely a personal tragedy, but reflects vital truths relevant to American society today. A young mother disappeared after a morning shopping trip, leaving behind a car full of purchased items, scattered keys, and a crying one-year-old son. Almost 3 decades of silence weighed heavily on the family, burdened by rumors and doubt when she had actually been brutally murdered. Decades-old DNA evidence finally gave her a voice. Lesson 1 to society. Technology and science can give victims thought-forgotten a voice. Thus, investing in forensic laboratories and DNA databases is important. One preserved sample can change the course of a family's fate. Careful evidence preservation matters. Lesson 2. Family and community perseverance. As public memory faded, Don, Eleanor, and Peter held annual vigils. Families should never give up, even when apathy or time isolates them. Finally, the story stands as a warning of how fragile everyday safety can be. A quiet coworker, a courteous neighbor, could be concealing a monstrous face. Herein lies the wider lesson for all Americans. Remain vigilant, see unusual signs, and stay believing in justice. It may be late, but with science, persistence, and community, it will never vanish. Dawn Magyar was a life stolen, but her legacy lives on because of the act of remembering, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of truth.